Okay. Live stream recorded. And I'll know in 10 seconds if we're all set.
You know, I think Stefan could be one of those remote mountain weathermen who just keeps everything going.
I do have quite the control station set up here. I mean, I've got all the toys you could want. But anyway, yes, we are on YouTube, and I will let you kick us off. Hopefully, we'll have other folks join us. Oh, we've got somebody calling in on the phone. I will see if that is Karen or if it's Barry.
You want me to start? Stefan?
Yeah, actually, why don't we just see it?
Okay.
Barry, is that you on the phone? I'm trying to look up your phone number. Let's
Hi,
Karen.
Hi, Barry.
Hi, Karen. Oh, Barry.
All right, Barry.
Hi, Barry.
Excellent. All right, cool. So I will rename you, and then we'll be all set. All right. I think we're good to go. Wig, I'll let you lead us off, and please do ask everybody to do an introduction. Go around the Hollywood Squares.
Yep, will do. So, Barry, why don't we start with you? Do you want to introduce yourself?
Barry Steinberg, a long-term traditional non-member.
Yeah, Barry's kind of like our official guest. And
a representative from APT also.
Yes.
Barry's a longtime APT. Weren't you on the board of APT for a long time, Barry?
Yes.
Yeah, and Barry is a steadfast supporter of transit, that's for sure. So this is the MBTA Rider Oversight Subcommittee on Capital Investment and Finance. And we have...
This is the full meeting.
Oh, this
I have the wrong agenda up. Sorry, I had the wrong agenda up. There we go.
Okay.
This is a full meeting today.
So now we've corrected it to be the full meeting.
Gotcha.
Thank you, Stefan.
Sorry for that. I had the wrong tab open.
That's okay. Here. That's all right. Why don't we have the guests introduce themselves first, and then we'll introduce, and then we'll go back to the real agenda. So, Rose, do you want to go first? Briefly?
Sure, yes. Thanks for having me. I should have put my affiliation on here as well. But I am with the Central Transportation Planning staff at the Regional Planning Organization. I'm in their Transit Analysis and Planning group. I'm the newest employee there, started at the end of January, and I'm happy to be here.
Super, super. And Eric, why don't you go next?
Sure. I'm Eric Berkman. I'm the Director of Transit Priority for MBTA. So my group does bus lane projects and transit signal priority projects. Basically anything that is going to help the bus move through the system faster and with better reliability. So I'm here today to talk about Columbus Ave bus lanes.
Okay. And why don't we have Carl go next? Carl, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Carl Seglem, Brighton resident, member of the Rider Oversight Committee, and eager to hear about the center running bus lanes.
And then I think maybe we'll go to the high-speed line, Maverick. Craig.
Hi, Craig Laskowski, public member, and I live in Milton.
Okay, and Len.
Hi, I'm Len Diggins, and I am co-chair of the Capital Investment and Finance Subcommittee, and I live in East Arlington. Use the 77. I'm sorry, I use the Red Line primarily. 77 only when the weather's horrible and I can't walk from Alewife.
And Len also puts an awful lot into RTAC, as folks probably know. And I'm Wig Zamor from Somerville, and kind of came on at the same time as Stefan, or more or less. And I think, Stefan, you're the only one not introduced at this point.
Hi, Stefan Wunsch. I'm in Lynn. I'm the co-chair of the Full Rock with WIG. I'm also the co-chair of the subcommittee for marketing operations and communications, along with Craig. And before the pandemic, I took commuter rail, green line, red line, orange line, and a couple different, I mean, I took a little bit of everything before the pandemic. And I miss that a lot.
So public comments, if there are some. Anybody want to make a distinct public comment before we start with the formal agenda?
Nothing at this time.
Okay, Barry, well, just let us know. Okay, so I guess we're ready to kick off into the main items. And looks like the first item is a discussion of Columbus Ave Center bus lane with Eric.
Yeah, I just want to jump in and express
Oh, I'm sorry,
appreciation.
Lynn.
Yeah, I just want to jump in and express appreciation for Eric, filling in, so because the guest that we originally had lined up for this month wasn't able to make it, and so Eric was scheduled for the March meeting, and I called him or emailed him on fairly short notice, and he was very agreeable to meeting us a month earlier. So very much appreciate that, Eric. Thanks.
Super.
Thank you
Yeah,
very
no
much.
problem. I have I've done quite a few presentations on Columbus Ave, so I was able to just pull one up and tweak it a little bit for you all. And I'm happy to be here. I'm happy to talk about this project.
Want me to
and-
relinquish the screen share so that you can?
Yep,
All
sounds
right.
great.
Go right ahead when you're ready.
Okay, let me see here. PowerPoint slideshow, share. Okay, can you guys?
Looks
can
good.
you all see this? All right, great. Let me expand my screen. So my name is Eric Berkman. I'm the Director of Transit Priority. I just introduced myself a couple minutes ago, so I'm just going to blaze right through here. And like I said, thanks for having me. I always enjoy coming and talking to you guys. This is maybe my third or fourth time. And I think you all do a great job at relating things that the riders need to know, and also keeping in mind that there's humans within the MBTA who are working to make the situation better for riders too. So I'm trying to touch on kind of both of those sides here, both the rider benefits and kind of the sausage making component, so to say, of how this project got done. So I always like to do a little intro on the Transit Priority Group, since we're only about 2 years old within the T. So me and 3 other people, though 2 of my positions are in waiting to be backfilled right now. If you know anybody who's a planner. Our team, we really are a data-driven team that focuses on approaches to make the bus faster and more reliable. So we know that our bus riders, with the bus having become the largest mode in the pandemic, at one point in the pandemic, that our bus riders deserve a reliable and fast trip, particularly given that it's a higher proportion of essential workers and tends to be a higher proportion of people of color, right? So in 2016, we had this report from CTPS that showed us where we kind of get the most bang for our buck for our bus lanes. So that kicked off the work of this group, and we collaborate with internal and external partners. And I think the real secret sauce to our work is that we have a clear implementation focus, and that we aren't just here to study the bus lanes, but rather to work with municipalities and work with internal partners to actually put them down on the roads. So that's the real key to our group. So a bus priority project's a little different because we own the service, we operate the buses, but it's the cities and other jurisdictions that own the roadways and the signals. So we can't, like updating signals on the red line or whatever, we own all of that infrastructure. So we can say, I'm going to provide a bus shuttle, I'm going to close the red line down, and I'm going to update the signals, right? But with a bus lane, we can't really do that because we don't own the roadway. So we really have to use our, our data-driven processes and our connections with the cities and towns in order to really get these projects through. So this is an example of the Silver Line bus lanes in Downtown Crossing. And as you can see, we also had a bike lane component to that project, which is typical for our projects, but was not included in the Columbus Ave project, which I'll touch on a little bit later. So since the Transit Priority Group came on, we've almost we've significantly expanded both the number of municipalities participating in the Transit Priority program and significantly expanded the mileage. So this actually doesn't even include anything that we implemented in 2021. So it's even more than what you see on this map here on the right now. And one of those projects that we implemented last year was the Columbus Ave bus lanes. So these are different than the typical bus lanes that you've seen around town. These go down the middle of the road, similar to the Green Line, and have a lot of these other upgraded BRT-like amenities that are a little bit different and a little bit, I guess, higher level than our typical side-running bus lanes. So this is a picture of I'm gesturing over here to my other monitor, though I know that you can't really see it. This is a picture of the platform pair at Walnut Ave. This is at the southernmost end of the facility. So as I mentioned, these are the first center running bus lanes in New England, very close collaboration between us and the city. One of the pieces of this story that I think is so important is that this was a really accelerated project that we accelerated due to the COVID pandemic. And we were able to go from sitting in City Hall around a conference room table saying, what if we put this down the middle of the road, to actually being in operations in about 25 months, 26 months, which is really very, very fast. So we did this by doing concurrent public engagement. As we were working on the design, we were doing public engagement that was informing the design. We used on-call design contracts and on-call construction contracts, which saved us about up to 2 years in the process, just from not having to bid those contracts out. And then we also used our MBTA capital funding, which was funding that was already available ahead of time. So we weren't going into a grant program that would have extended the timeline or any of that. So that was, I'm really proud of how we were able to deliver this project so quickly. And I see Len has his hand up, so I'll get to that in a moment, but I just wanted to mention that one of the reasons we prioritize this corridor is because it was already a very high delay area with a very frequent consolidated frequency. A lot of services were coming together as they were going up to Jackson Square and to Ruggles. It had continued high ridership in the pandemic. I think it retained over 70% of its ridership in the pandemic, and about 90% of the riders on this corridor were people of color. So, and also a low English proficiency population. So it was from an equity standpoint, this was really a no-brainer corridor. So Len, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, thanks. So can you describe more about the on-call contract, because I'm not familiar with those?
Yeah, so the T uses some general engineering contracts, which are really for, they're typically used for smaller projects, which are like our Patty project uses on-calls, where you have a bus stop that needs to be redesigned, but to bid that out for design would take a pretty significant amount of time and effort. So you bid a general engineering contract and you say, for example, I'm going to let this contract and take, say, 100 bus stop redesigns and put them into this contract, but I don't know what the stops are going to be yet. So as you award that contract, you kind of go through the process and you sort of chip away at the authorized funds. And then as you get to the end, you reauthorize a new general engineering contract that just helps you, it helps you move a little bit faster, but we don't like to do very large projects or multiple large projects under a general engineering contract, because we want to make sure that we're still competitive in terms of offering design services and awarding those contracts. So
thanks, appreciate it.
Yeah, you could get a much better, just disclaimer, you could get a much better explanation of that from capital delivery. So if that wasn't 100%, that may not be 100% accurate, but that's my understanding. I can arrange for somebody from capital delivery to answer that in a little bit better detail for you.
Well, that'd be great. Because I'm interested in that whole notion, and so maybe we can get a name and I can ask them to come and talk to the capital investment, the finance subcommittee. I'm not complaining about the process. I just like to understand it better. Yeah. So thank you. Appreciate it.
Yeah, same for me too. I mean, the description that you're giving to it, meaning that it's a more nimble way of going about it, is really interesting to me. Is the term something that's relatively new? I mean, or on call, or is it really something that the T hasn't done before? In your experience, you might not be able to.
Yeah,
Speak
so
to.
we've used them for a while. The thing with the bus lane project is that it's not usually a very high dollar amount project. I mean, this was about a $12 million project total, and it's the most expensive bus priority project that we've done since I've been here, right? So, and our typical projects are, you know, $300,000, $400,000 at the most. You know, an expensive project for us that's a side running project. I don't think we've done one that's been more than $1 million yet. They're usually in the neighborhood of $500,000. So for our typical side running, like paint only projects, it's pretty easy to do those with a GEC because they're not a super high dollar amount contract. But for these larger projects, it is a little bit unusual for us to do that using a GEC, just because for the higher capital projects, we want to make sure that we're getting that we're offering the consultant landscape a chance to compete for our bigger designs. But in the interest of delivering this quickly, we were able to make the case to use a GEC for this project. Yeah. Okay, so are there any other questions on that before I move on? Okay, great.
Thanks.
So I want to take a little bit to explain how the center running bus lanes work. If you haven't made it down to JP or Roxbury yet to take a look at this, I usually describe it to people as being similar to the green line. The green line goes down the middle, but I think we manage the traffic conflict differently here, given that they're both buses, or that they're buses and other rubber tired vehicles. So the idea of this design, I don't know if you can see my mouse pointer. Great, so the idea of this design is that the bus boarding platforms are in the middle here between the bus lane and the general purpose lane. So the cars go safely behind the platform, and this is a signalized pedestrian crossing here. So that means that if you are a pedestrian, or if you're trying to cross the street, you only have to cross one general purpose lane of traffic. So that's about 12 feet. And then you get to this pedestrian refuge here that is sheltered with this curb and this signal post. You have a signalized crossing you need to cross. Then you have 2 bus lanes that you need to cross, and then 1 general purpose lane. And of course, the bus lanes are less crowded than a general purpose lane. That's how you know it's working. If you don't see a lot of cars in there, you only see buses in there, right? So one of the keys of this design, of this center running design, is that we can use it with our existing fleet. A lot of other center running projects, Indianapolis, for example, if with their Indigo service, they have true center platforms that would be in the middle here, a median platform, but that requires your buses to have left side doors. So because of the way we usually do our transit priority projects, and that we're targeting specific shorter corridors of congestion rather than doing these long BRT type projects, we really wanted to make sure that we could use all of our existing fleet with our transit priority projects. So this design achieves that by offering the platform on the right side. So we don't need specialized left side door buses. As the car comes down here, you see that it has to chicane around the platform. So this naturally slows speeds on the corridor. This was a very fast corridor before. And then the street overall feels more like a place for people rather than just for cars. So the perception of this busy street, I think, really improves, and it becomes a little bit calmer, a little bit safer for people who are in the neighborhood, right? So this is an aerial view from the roundhouse building that's near Eggleston Square. We're looking down on the platform pair that's at Weld Ave, which is right here. I think my next, before I go to this slide, I want to call out that so a typical project would include a protected bike lane, but the city was in process with a separate bike plan for this area when we embarked on this project. But we have surpassed the timeline of the bike plan. So we delivered this project before the city could get the bike project up. But that's why this didn't include a bike facility, is because the city is still in process of their separate bike plan. And one of the reasons that we went with the center running configuration as well is that if you notice, we were able to retain, I believe, about 70% of the parking on the corridor. So a pretty significant amount of parking was retained. And you can't really see it very well in this picture, but kind of toward the edges here, you see there's still street parking. So the general purpose lane shifts over between the bus lane and the street parking so that we can retain that for the community, which was something that we heard pretty clearly in the public process. So before I go to the next slide, I will call on Wig.
Yeah, so it sounds like you use the parking spaces that are removed to gain the extra space to
With
do
platforms.
the geometry. Okay,
Correct.
thanks.
Yep, that's exactly what we did. Stefan?
Yeah, I actually just wanted to call out that Karen joined in the last few minutes and I hadn't noticed it first. So Karen, do you want to just say hi, just to make sure we can hear you? Or do you want to ask any questions? Just like give us a check 1, 2, just really quick, but you don't have to. Okay, don't worry about it, Karen, but you have the permission to unmute yourself if you want to jump right in. Go ahead, Eric, back to you.
I may have a couple questions. I may want to go back to this slide, but I think, Eric, I'll let you keep going. I know it's frustrating to kind of get cut off mid-presentation. So let me keep you going, and I'll hold a couple questions for a little bit later in the presentation.
Okay. Yeah, I don't mind if something comes up, I'll go back to. So one of the things about this is that the parallel parking. So if you have like, for example, Brighton Ave. So if the bus lane on Brighton Ave is what we call a parking offset lane. So you have the parallel parking adjacent to the bus lane. You're in the bus lane, a car has to pull in to search for the parking spot. They reverse to go into the parking spot. Side streets and driveways, the car merges into the bus lane to make a turn. Maybe they have to stop for a pedestrian crossing the street or a cyclist, right? Same with a driveway. If you're a car driver, you pull into a driveway and you slow down because you're going to bump up to go over the sidewalk, right? So these are all points of friction that are eliminated in the center running configuration because all of those turns, they're friction for the general purpose traffic now rather than the bus lane. But we do have some other conflicts that we need to consider, specifically at signalized intersections. And we also end up with some other traffic circulation changes along the way. For example, you are no longer able to make a left turn into these side streets here from the general purpose lane here. So there's other things that we need to consider as we're doing these types of projects, right? So here I just called out a couple of locations. So this is Walnut Ave over here where we had some signal separation. Here is just the side street where there were some turn restrictions. This would be a parallel parking spot. And then this, of course, is another side street. But as you can see, none of these are going to impact the operations of the bus lane. So I apologize, this one's a little bit hard to see, but this is at the new, I think it's Bragdon Street. And this is where the new fire station is. So you can see here we have this black SUV is waiting to turn left. These cars have gone through. We have the green ball to go through the intersection for general purpose traffic. A left arrow that's red right now because this vertical white bar indicates that the bus can proceed through the intersection. You see we do have a bus approaching in the other direction, so they'll have the vertical white bar to pass through, at which point this, I think the next one in the cycle is the left turn arrow. So this is an example where the general purpose traffic is going to be to the right of the bus, even though they're turning left. So we need to make sure that we have that signal separation in place so that everybody's safe as they pass through the intersection. So this is a new type of signal. We use these on the green line above ground, but it's a new type of signal for bus. So, Stefan?
I'm curious about that signal because, as you mentioned, I've seen it used quite a bit on the green line, but I'm old enough to remember when it was actually an arrowhead on it. And it seems like the standard now for transit signal is without an arrowhead and just being either a vertical bar for go, horizontal for stop. I don't even think there's any other variations that, well, not that I've seen in a while. Is that like an international standard, or was the arrowhead confusing to drivers, and like without the arrowhead it's more clearly for transit?
Yeah, so we actually have for the bus transit signals we use a horizontal red bar. Then we use a triangle, a white triangle, which is equivalent, like an amber equivalent. So proceed to stop, and then the vertical white bars to go through. So it's a little bit different than the trolley signals. And actually, for this project, we changed the design even a little bit from what you currently see in Watertown, which I think is just a horizontal white bar and a vertical white bar. The reason being that And I don't know the reasoning behind the trolley signaling, but for the bus, we wanted to make sure that the operator had a little bit of a warning just before, before we went from a vertical light bar to a horizontal bar, because we don't want to have people, thrown down in the bus because the bus has to stop, or, making that judgment call on whether it's safe to go through or not. Which, is the same reason that you see an amber light for your typical traffic signal.
Is this been, so we really braved new ground here. There's no other transit system with center running. Is there any other transit system in the country running something similar?
Yeah, so Indianapolis with their Indigo service, San Francisco, I think just opened or is about to open their Van Ness busway. I understand the idea of prioritized bus lanes. It's the signaling that in particular that I'm curious about. Yeah, so other agencies do use special transit signals for this exact reason. I think San Diego's BRT system uses this as well. But it's not uncommon, I would say, to use transit signals for bus. It's just this entire configuration is new for New England and is new for MBTA. So, and I'm not sure, I don't think they have this treatment in New York, but the ones I know of are San Diego, San Francisco, Indianapolis, and I'm sure.
Yeah, I was just trying to get did we make up the triangles and things like that, or was it?
Yeah, no. So we did not. Those other systems also use transit signaling. I'm not sure if it's exactly the same, but I do believe that they have a 3-section. We would call this a 3-section signal head because it has 3 sections. Probably self-explanatory.
No, it makes 100% sense to not use the same. You have to use something different than what the car driver's seeing in the lane next door. So that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, one thing that we are pretty picky about for the transit signals is we want the horizontal bar to be red rather than white. And I think other agencies and the trolleys typically use a white horizontal bar. This is just anecdotal in terms of other agencies, but the reason we wanted it to be red is because we didn't want there to be any any question of whether you could go through or not. And we figured if it's red, if it's red, you stop. So we wanted to be really clear about you can go on white, but you can't go on red. So that is something that's a little bit different. In fact, we're dealing with we're dealing with that in some other projects around the city too, where it's a different consultant or contractor who we don't typically work with, and trying to reinforce that the MBTA standard is the red horizontal bar rather than the white.
Well, sorry, one more thing about the signals. What, just off the top of your head, what would you say was the capital cost impact for the signal changes specifically, like a percentage of the whole? I mean, to me, I always think of signals and traffic signals being more complicated than the average person realizes. And if you're doing, as you said, custom heads and that kind of thing, was that a big dollar cost or not really a big deal?
Yeah, so I guess I couldn't really say off the top of my head the amount that the signals cost versus the other stuff. But, with signals, what I've learned since being in this position is that you're exactly right. Like signals are that 99% invisible kind of thing that you don't realize all that goes into it. So I don't think you can see in this picture, but for every signal that you see or for every intersection you see, there's a control cabinet. It has to be a certain size. As you add complication, you need more space in the cabinet because it needs additional components, right? The detection is a whole other, animal, right? So do you have the loops embedded in the ground like you see here? We have these detection loops in here. Do you have optical detection, right? But usually it's the mast arms and the foundations that are the most expensive because they need to be fabricated and they need to be the right, strength for the wind, the wind and the mass of physically what's on there. But the signal head actually, so the heads aren't a custom made head. It's a standard head that's used for, trolley and other bus and stuff, but it is a little bit, it took a little bit more lead time to get them. So it's not a custom fabricated component, but it's not a typical component that most contractors would have on hand either, right? So special order, not special manufacture, I would say. But I'm not sure exactly what, I don't know what the exact cost was for the signal related.
Okay, no, that's fine. I mean, I'll leave that subject with one comment I got to share with everybody. Back when I was still living in Brighton, right on Colfa Comm Ave, one day I was waiting at the intersection of Chestnut Hill Ave and Com Ave, which you probably know is a really complicated intersection, four-way with left turn only. And I happened to see a crew working on the control box for the signals, and it was unbelievable. I mean, it looked like something out of a sci-fi movie with blinking lights. And I mean, I'm a technology guy, and I was absolutely amazed by how much equipment was packed in there. So that's why I wanted to mention that. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, we have on some of our other projects, even like the transit signal priority projects, we've had situations where we needed to upgrade the cabinet itself because there wasn't enough space to put in the additional PSP components that we need. And that can be really a pain because the cabinets themselves are expensive, but then also you may need a bigger foundation for the cabinet. It has to be, you know, crash worthy, et cetera. So it can really get the signal stuff for something that's such a simple concept in theory can really get pretty complicated and can get expensive. So Wig, go ahead. Oh, sorry.
So this is making me think of an odd question, which is, do you or people you work with recognize Boston drivers as a particular species that have to be considered when you're doing these kinds of projects?
Yeah, so I would say this comes up pretty frequently, and I'm, you know, not being from here myself, I'm from Michigan originally. I am maybe equal parts like, oh yeah, we're a little more aggressive here, and like if each city you go to will say, but we're different here, so that won't work here because we're different, right? So you know, some stuff that we took into consideration was like this phase here, we didn't want the protected left turn phase to run before the transit phase because we didn't want a late arriving left turner like coming across the front of the bus or hitting the side of the bus. So we changed the way the phasing worked so that the transit signal would come on after the pedestrian signal, I think. So you would still have that additional you wouldn't have a late arriving left turning car, you know, coming up against the side of the bus. That's one example. Another example would be we installed some other flex posts here around in Eggleston Square around the McDonald's drive-through because we found that people were making, you know, illegal left turns and U-turns there, which was a safety issue. So I would say like, I would anticipate that, you know, I haven't worked on a transit priority project in a city other than Boston really.
Yeah.
But I would anticipate that those are the same types of things that people are dealing with elsewhere. And that, you know, we're special just like everybody else, right? Like the drivers here are pretty aggressive, but you know, in other areas of the country, they're also pretty aggressive. We just try to design for the best facility that we can to keep everybody safe, right? So, but there have been, you know, you're right, there were considerations, the signal phasing changes, the additional signage, the flex posts.
Yeah, so I have three really tiny sub points that aren't really questions, but you know, I think cities that have more unusual street patterns or maybe older may present just naturally different issues. And you're showing some great street sections that are pretty straight here, but there are, you know, near Boston Garden and under the expressway and stuff, there are some unusual conditions. And when I was living in Maine and unfamiliar with here, I used to get befuddled a little bit. And as soon as people saw my Maine plates, they often cut me a break, which was appreciated. And then the last thing I'll say, which reflects something that you just said, when I started grad school at MIT, I had a classmate from Seattle, Washington, and he wasn't sure whether he was going to drive a car or not, he was going to use a car or not during the school year. He was in Central Square and he saw a driver go through a red light, do a U-turn and go back through the red light the other way. Police car on the side of the road with coffee and donuts, just not paying attention. And he said, I decided I'm never driving in Boston. It's way above my league. Anyway, didn't mean to interrupt you, but thank you.
Yeah, I think one thing you did touch on is that we had to take particular consideration of the roadway network around here, especially when we were doing, you know, turn movement changes, because we wanted to make sure that we didn't strand anybody. In fact, on one street, I want to say it was the I guess it would be the west side of West Walnut Park, we received a comment from somebody who was like, I used to be able to turn left or right into my street, but now I can only turn right in and right out. And so that was one issue that we've been tracking to try to figure out, how can we make the circulation a little bit less arduous, right? And I think that was an interesting thing for me to realize when we received that comment from that individual who actually is an MBTA employee. Because we had spent a lot of time thinking through that. And it just goes to show that, that's the reason that we have the public engagement piece. And that's the reason that we take feedback from people, is because you can, even with your best intentions, it's really hard to catch all those little issues. So, ever improving, right? Or at least in the pursuit of that.
I mean,
Let's see.
how do you handle a delivery truck that's going to be someplace for about 10 minutes?
Yeah, so that is a challenge, and we have a location by a Dunkin' Donuts there that's also at West Walnut Park, and the truck often parks in the Gore area, kind of at the end of the platform, which works okay. Originally, there was supposed to be some additional loading zones that we're still working on with the city, but that didn't work out in time for the opening. So what you'll notice in this project is that there isn't a physical barrier between the bus lane and the adjacent lanes in most cases, except for where we think there's a really serious safety consideration. And so one of the reasons for that is because if there's an obstruction, if there's a broken down bus, if there's a vehicle that's stopped in the gourd area here to load, a 40-foot truck, like for 10 minutes, bringing a bunch of stuff into, a 60 square foot Dunkin' Donuts, right? We want to make sure that the bus doesn't get trapped in the bus lane, right? And we also allow emergency vehicles, paratransit vehicles, and school buses to use these. So we also need to make sure that they can have access to the curb if they're responding to emergency, or they need to get in or out, or they need to go around, or whatever. We spend a lot of time talking about Dunkin' Donuts trucks and Dunkin' Donuts traffic. And I think we just have to design the best we can. Like, we're not always going to be able to find every use case like that. But like in Eggleston Square, for example, there's some 15-minute parking for loading, unloading. That I would say even has had a little bit of mixed success, but has been pretty good. But one of the things that Matt Moran, who is the BTD transit director at the city, in the very early transit priority projects that we worked together on, he always said that a transit priority project starts with understanding the curb regulation, which I think is really intuitive in that, you can change parking regulations, you can change turning regulations, but you need to also consider the loading zones, right? So I know that's kind of a long answer. That's one thing that we focused a lot on Brighton Ave. But in this configuration, even where you have a double parked loading vehicle, even for like an Uber or Lyft or whatever, the moving traffic stays in the bus lane, right? So that's one of the other benefits of the center running bus lane, is that you don't have that additional friction piece, even if you do have a double parker.
No. This is fine. This is one of the areas I was going to touch on. If you don't mind going back those two slides to that kind of the first overhead shot.
This one?
Yeah, this one right here. So how the kind of two businesses in the middle of the page, there's a green business and a red business. How would that green business, the green business doesn't have a curb, right? What's the expectation for that green business to get deliveries, or how is that?
So
I understand 100% what you're saying, and the other where you have a curb, it's one. Those are the challenge points to me. Where you have parking, that's okay. That you can make that a loading zone. That's a solve. And in other areas, if you don't have parking, but you don't have a divider, I understand that cars can move over into the bus only lane to get around a double parked vehicle. But it's those in those choke points like that where you actually you technically don't have there's no way to move around. You wouldn't expect a car to go into the the platform area, right?
Right.
So
Yeah, so this area right here is actually the loading zone for on Columbus Ave. I think we set up a loading zone here on the side street as well, as sort of an overflow. What typically happens is there will be loading. What I've seen happen at least is there will be loading or unloading here, and occasionally there will be another vehicle kind of in this gourd area. This is another example where, you know, the stop traffic blocks the general purpose lane rather than the bus lane. So we've worked with the city a little bit on figuring out the best solution for this, though I wouldn't say that we have anything ready to go yet. But what will usually happen is where there's additional vehicles loading here, the cars will shift into the bus lane as they come through and kind of come back around, chicaning around these flex posts, or even come up here and chicane over, which, you know, is not really the solution that we would want, but it is sort of a victory of the design in that we don't have the stopped vehicle in the bus lane. The vehicles that are in the bus lane are moving around an obstruction in the general purpose lane. So if I remember correctly, though I haven't verified the signage, there's a loading zone that's right here. It might actually be on this side, but that's the intent, is that there's a primary loading zone here and then a secondary one on the side street. And there is the network behind here. I forgot the name of the street, but there's a parallel street behind here that provides good access up to Washington Street.
How has the reception been from the businesses who are impacted? You talked a little bit about, you know, individuals who live on streets not being able to take lefts anymore. But what about some of these? What about the businesses along that are impacted?
Yeah, so the city, I don't primarily do the public engagement piece. We usually rely on the city to do that public engagement stuff. But you know, with our typical projects, there's a lot of trepidation in the beginning of, you know, the construction is going to impact me or the parking changes are going to impact me. I would say that we usually have people, the businesses typically will come around by the end if they weren't supportive in the beginning. I'd say this project had a pretty decent amount of support from the public from the very beginning, I think, because there's such a high transit share on this corridor. So, you know, I can bring somebody from the city to talk more about the public engagement piece specifically, or Livable Streets, an advocacy group did a survey recently on from the general public. I don't think specific to businesses, but they would be another good group to come to speak about kind of the public perception of the project overall, I would say. So we did have
in generally, in full disclosure, I have not taken a bus down the corridor, but I've driven the corridor, and I'm generally supportive of bus lanes. I think where my framing always is I don't want these bus lanes to be. I think it's unfair to present the bus lanes as a magic bullet. That there are pros and cons to the when it comes down to it. There's only so much real estate on a street, and you have to take from one area to give to the other. And if we're prioritizing bus, that's fine. That may be the right decision for a corridor like this. And I think in this corridor it is. But there are compromises you have to make on the other side. That there are people who won't be able to take that left in the streets. There are going to be businesses who the delivery driver is going to have to park a half block down as in front. So I think it's more just being trying to tell the full. I'm cognizant of trying to tell that full story of the zero sum game that is a street, and that it's okay to prioritize buses, and that's probably the best thing for that neighborhood. But there are compromises that need to be made.
Yeah, and I think that's fair, and I think you know, that's why, like I said before, that's why we always go into the public engagement process, and we're, you know, listening to people and listening to their concerns, right? So I know here, I think a lot of the bus lane specific concerns were sort of there were a lot of bike accommodation related concerns. So I think that, you know, some of that maybe I don't distraction is not the right word, but I think some of that feedback maybe drowned out a little bit the bus lane specific feedback as we were going to the project. And like I said, William Moose at City of Boston and Matt Moran at City of Boston, they really were doing most of the public engagement and outreach for this project. But I don't recall there being really a lot of significant business access concerns for this, but rather more, as you know, the Orange Line elevated train used to go down this corridor. And so I think for some in the community, they were excited to see another, in some ways, more transit investment here that, maybe they'd been waiting for since the elevated came down. So this may have just been a unique corridor overall.
It'll never happen, but I always like the idea of expanding rail. Do you think the infrastructure you built here, if you ever wanted to run a green line down the center of this instead of a bus, do you think could you utilize the same platforms? Is there any is this a step in that direction? I know I'm living in a fantasy world.
I don't know. I just really don't know. I wouldn't even speak to it. I'd like to think so. At the very least, we don't own this middle of the street. It's still a city street, but we have demonstrated that the dedicated space, that the roadway can function with the dedicated transit space down the middle. So I couldn't really say if that will lead to any other further upgrade down the road, or even if this would support that type of upgrade. But I think what's great here is that we show that the roadway can accommodate one lane of general purpose traffic and a bus lane.
The one thing I think, and my last point, and I'll let you keep going, let other people ask questions. The reason why I want to go back to this visual, this is a good visual, 100% agree. It can accommodate a center lane bus in traffic. I can't see how you fit a bike lane in here. There's not room to do it, and that's okay. If more people in this particular community take bus than own bikes, we should prioritize bus over bike. Once again, it's that zero-sum game of figuring out what's the best use of that space. But I'll be really curious if they find a way to magically add. It's around it because essentially we clearly see in this visual is that the platforms, the center platforms, each take a full lane for that brief area, for that block where you have the station, and that's it's at those choke points where you wouldn't have it. You don't have room to fit in a bike lane.
Yeah, and I see two other hands raised, but the city's plan, I think, is for a separate network, but I can't really speak to what their bike plan is, though I believe they already have some information up on the website for it. There could be bike accommodations as long as they're shared with either general purpose or bus traffic where the platforms are, but it would be really significant parking impact outside of where there's the platforms, right? So other than that, I don't know where the resources are specifically for the bike plan.
You could take away the parking lanes, but then you'd have a bike lane for 2 blocks, and then all of a sudden you'd have a non-bike lane where around the platforms, and that's I'd have interesting safety concerns about that, but I'll let other people talk.
Sure. Wig?
Yeah, so just on the bikes, it happens that I'm teaching a bicyclist exposure class at Harvard Medical School tomorrow, which I do once a year for a bicycle planning class. Mm-hmm. And I think if you've got fairly close by parallel streets that are smaller, the cyclists are better off there. Many of the cyclists do not understand how dangerous the vehicle emissions are from an inhalation point of view. They assume because they're getting exercise, they're going to be super healthy wherever they are. And sorry for this to be an aside, but I think a lot of people don't know this, but the study that I use the most is from Copenhagen. And the cyclists in Copenhagen who live in the 10% most polluted part of the city have higher cardiovascular and total mortality than the people who get no exercise at all.
Wow.
And and who live in the 50% cleanest part of Copenhagen. I mean, that's an important consideration. Mm. There's no question that exercise is really healthy for cyclists, but people way underestimate the damage from ultrafine particles from transportation. Now, if everything goes electric, the problem gets to be a little less. And then just to end there, what is the total vehicles per day in this corridor?
For buses or for?
Well, for everything.
I don't know offhand.
You know, if it's 5,000 or less, then I wouldn't worry about it. But if
Yeah.
it's 20,000, that's gonna be a lot of exposure to bicyclists, and their inhalation rate is a lot higher, even when they're fit. You know, they're inhaling a lot. But I'll get off of that. But I just wanted to mention that bit about if there are parallel smaller streets that bicyclists can go on, they're probably healthier there anyway.
Okay. Can you guys still see my screen?
Yep.
Okay, great. Sorry, my second monitor sometimes turns itself off and it makes it tough. Stefan, you had a question?
Yeah, just a quick thing about those two white cars. Using the frame of reference again as the green storefront and the red storefront. I see those two white cars. They kind of have a vibe of being MBTA vehicles, but that led me to ask, well, what if there were a pattern of emerging of people parking in those like approach areas to the platform? Is there is it
so
MBTA who would put up signage, or is BTD obligated to do that?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and I forgot to call it out. But these platforms actually, each one has space for one service vehicle parking spot. So the idea is, this was a little bit of a point of contention with the city, and I also recognize kind of the cognitive dissonance of offering an agency parking spot at a bus stop, right? However, as you see here, this was, I think, the third day that the facility was open, maybe. We have the need sometimes for an inspector at a stop, or, you know, in really, you know, sometimes what we would call a swing on, though this is not a place that we would typically switch operators. The example I always gave is, you know, where do I park if I need to change a light bulb in the shelter? And I have to choose between blocking the only general purpose lane or blocking the bus lane and blocking the platform, right? So those spots, this one's a little bit long because there's also the side street, so we didn't want to have the chicaning where there's also a side street. But each bus boarding platform has one service vehicle parking space to provide, you know, the emergency or even non-emergency response or services to the platform, snow removal, for example. But we designed it specifically for that purpose, so that somebody who needs to service the platform doesn't block either the general purpose lane or the bus lane.
I guess my only pushback on that would be, the only pushback on that would be that your pretty rare occasions, what you're talking about, as opposed to businesses who need deliveries every day. The delivery spot is now a half block down, where the change a light bulb guy gets his own special spot for the once in a blue moons, where theoretically when those should happen.
Yeah, I think you know, I don't have any data.
Can't the inspector park a block down and walk? Do we have to make it, as opposed to, why make the delivery guy hoof the packages or the you know, pallets of food into the restaurant, as opposed to the inspector park a block down or on the side street?
Yeah, I can understand that. I think in most cases, and I think in all of the cases where we have deliveries, we're still able to offer an adjacent loading zone. So for even this green and red business here, it's on the side street. So I think, you know, that's a fair assessment, but I think that we actually are able to have kind of both. But I'm not sure that every design that we have will be able to offer that. This is the first one, so, you know, things may change in future designs.
Well, you know, they're also just parking in the space that you have to create for the station, right?
Right.
I mean, there's not really any choice there.
Yeah,
I mean,
we still will have to have the chicaned area, or, you know, the merge over area and the chicane, just to help general purpose traffic avoid.
Yeah.
So
But
this is an unusually long one. Even if there were no service vehicle parking here, we wouldn't have been able to offer a loading zone in front of the green and red business, because that's the area that the general purpose traffic has to shift over to avoid the platform.
But at the same time, I certainly understand Craig's sentiment on this. Thank you.
All right, so I'm going to keep moving. So we also were able to provide a bunch of pedestrian improvements on the corridor. So for example, this is a rectangular rapid flashing beacon in front of the Eggleston Square Branch Public Library to help make the crossing condition a little bit better. There's not a bus boarding platform here, but bus riders are also pedestrians who need to cross the street, right? So we're interested in improving the corridor for everybody multimodally. So in addition to this example, we reconstructed all the curb ramps on the corridor. So I want to say it was 49 curb ramps. We added 2 raised crosswalks at side streets, and we also added some bump outs in addition to the refuges of the platform themselves. As you saw in the other image, it results in a lot narrower crossings, particularly where there's the boarding platforms. But there were improvements to the crossing conditions throughout the entire corridor, not just where there's the bus stops. And then one of the things that's really popular that I also really enjoy myself is we have a really much higher level of amenities at the stops for the riders. So there are these new architecturally designed bus shelters with integrated lighting. We have additional lighting on the platforms. There's these emergency call boxes that connect you to transit police. And we have security cameras on the platforms, which I didn't realize until this project, but is one of the things that we prefer to add when we have a call box, because if you connect to the police, they want to be able to see what's happening, right? Of course, there's crash barriers to prevent vehicle incursion up onto the platforms. That's that bench wall that you see in the back. The wayfinding and the branding is similar to what you would see at a rapid transit station, again, sort of signaling that higher level of service and like an upgraded type of experience, right? We have 9-inch curbs here, so you can really notice it when you step onto the bus that you don't have to step up as high. Though other agencies do use higher standards. In Indianapolis, I think they use a 14-inch curb. And then we also have these video screens that have real-time arrival information. And the key here is that they have audio equivalency. So they periodically make an announcement of what are the next departures, which is the first time that we've done that in the bus system, and our customer technology department worked really hard on that. So it's pretty cool. So I have a close-up of these screens here. And you can see, of course, we have the stop location and the current time. You have the next departures. Here you can see they're in time order, but also separated by route. And then those little figures there, they represent if the bus is crowded or not, which you can see in your phone app now, but we're also offering that on the screen. And then finally, we have the system announcements. In fact, these screens can be taken over by the Operations Control Center and display custom announcements if there's some emergency happening or whatever. The stop is closed. And then finally, there's speakers in the screen that, like I said, will provide audio equivalents for what's visually on the screen in case you are a low vision person. And this is just, I didn't have a good close-up. So this is just a weirdly cut off close-up that I took that I couldn't find a better one in my phone, sorry.
I know I've been the one asking tough questions, being a little critical here, but I think these stations I think the amenities here are fantastic. I think that these are a real true benefit of having those big kind of center stations.
Thanks. the pictures are extraordinarily clear too. I mean, I think that's why we've had such a good discussion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so one of the things we do with our transit priority projects is I always schedule our MBTA photographer to go out and take before construction, during construction, and after construction photos. So her name's Susanna Hay. She's actually award-winning, which she's won transportation photography awards, which I didn't even know was a thing. But we have all kinds of photos of our projects, and I've been really particular about scheduling her to go out, and I think it has paid off in the long run. So, and I appreciate, Craig, what you said about the amenities. So I'm going to speed up a little bit because I know I only have a little bit of time left, but the other piece of this is that it's a pretty decent agency change in terms of how we operate the bus and for the type of facility. So we had to work really closely with our training school. So as early as September 2020, which was almost a year before the facility opened, we sent kind of an orientation guide. This is what's happening out there on Columbus Ave and what you can expect to see. About a year later, when we knew really what the facility looked like based on the real world construction, we did a lot more comprehensive training materials. We did like a 9-page book and a poster and like a takeaway trifold flyer for each of the operators. And we offered that on the kind of the internal communication system at the Everbridge T-Stop, which is our intranet, and then also through in-person interactions. And we tracked each operator that they had been trained on the facility before it opened. So it was a little bit hard because it was still under construction and we had taken the roadway space and changed this, the roadway for people in the area. So we didn't want it to be empty without any buses running in it for very long, but we still, of course, had the need to do operational testing and training. So then additionally, people are on vacation, people change their work periodically throughout the year. There are people who cover for people who call out sick or for who are on vacation. So we needed to reach all of those people as well. And all of this had to happen during the COVID pandemic, right? So the training was a little bit difficult, but it worked out, but it was a new type of process for us in terms of the materials we produced and how we trained operators on the facility. And then we also started a pretty intense feedback mechanism of tracking issues that operators reported so we could make tweaks to the facility before it opened. So for example, the bottom right here, you see that's one side of the trifold flyer that had some graphics on how to use the facility. You may have seen these stickers, that's the top right in all of our buses, but it's sort of a notification sticker, I guess, for the operator in case they forget what the signals mean. And on the left side here is our bus lanes and signals guides intranet section, which has a bunch of different training materials that operators themselves or their training school can go online and download and print out, or whatever they need to do with the training materials. So this was a new process for us with Columbus Ave that we produced all of this additional stuff. Normally it would be more of like a listening session type format in the garage as we open, a side run and bus lane. But since this had some new components to it, we wanted to have a heavier touch. So we used an Asana project as well. So operators and training school inspectors could email directly into this project tab to open up a new issue. So we tracked a bunch of different issues, and they really ran the gamut between signage changes, signal timing changes, to like the curb is the wrong height or whatever, right? So one example is the median in Eggleston Square. We needed to shave it back a little bit because of the way the buses had to enter with the general purpose traffic and with the loading zone there in Eggleston Square. So this is just an example from our contractor out in the field, where after the lane had already opened, we went back out and we had to move a storm drain and move the curb back to make the vehicle movement easier for the buses. It wasn't something that was preventing the use of the facility, but the change made it a lot easier and safer for the operation. So, that was the exact reason that we set up that feedback mechanism, to understand where we needed to make some tweaks before finalizing the project. So we have others in the works, right? So you may have heard that we received grant funding, and the city of Boston received grant funding for a similar project on Blue Hill Ave. That's all the way from Mattapan up to Grove Hall. That's in public engagement right now. So the exact details of the project aren't totally worked out yet, and they may tweak and change a little bit through the public engagement, but the city is embarking on that now. And you can see the top left is a rendering of that, which includes a bike facility, much of which is parking protected. You may have heard in an MPO meeting, I think last summer, we've already received funding. This was before the current Columbus facility opened, to extend that up to Ruggles. So you'll see a similar treatment on Columbus Ave all the way up to Ruggles, with the platforms and amenities and the center running stuff. And then we're also talking about Linway. We put in a grant application for the RAISE program, which used to be Tiger and also used to be Build, for Linway last year. So we're still in discussion about that connection from Wonderland up through Central Square. We have discussed this about South Mass Ave in Cambridge, between roughly Central Square and the river. And then we also have some other corridors that are in the works as well. that I can't really announce today, but I think people have seen Columbus Ave as a great example of what we can do in terms of a high quality bus facility. And so that has really opened up the conversation in other municipalities as well. And then this is just a thanking everybody. This is just the internal coordination slide, but there's even more external groups, I would say. And this was really a very wide-reaching effort within the agency that required at least a little bit of participation from everybody you see here, and probably even more groups. But it was pretty great to see everybody come together on making the project a reality. So anyway, I know we had questions throughout, but I'm happy to take more questions. Otherwise, here's my contact info on the screen. You can feel free to reach out.
Yeah. Karen, did you want to ask anything? You've been pretty quiet the whole time. Again, Karen, you don't have to, but I just want to make sure you have the opportunity. I'll throw one quick question in about Lynn, because I live in Lynn, as I mentioned earlier. Without going into too much detail, what's the current status of the Western Avenue redesign for the bus priority?
Yeah, so I'm not sure about, so Western Ave was brought up in the Lynn Transit Action Plan, which is the MassDOT Office of Transportation Planning project a couple of years ago. We have, in the MassDOT Shared Streets and Spaces program, we started installing bus lanes from the Belden Bly Bridge up to Ida Street, which is just past the MBTA garage there. Those are about 75% complete. The lane reassignment is there and the signal changes are there, though this doesn't include any of those transit signals that you saw earlier. And it's just waiting on some more, we ran out of weather. So it's just waiting on finishing the red paint in the southbound direction between Cooper Street and the bridge. But I say it's about 75% complete. And I think it's actually really improved traffic on Western Ave. In fact, I'm so used to sitting, waiting for that merge to happen after the GE driveway by the bus garage there, that when I drove up there the other day to look at the bus lanes, I felt like it was a blink and miss it situation, because I didn't have to wait to merge after the driveway, which is exactly what we expected would happen. So
yep,
that was nice.
That is exactly right. Yeah, but do you know what time frame for what is it, Ida Street up to the mini rotary?
I don't know.
That's okay.
Yeah, I'd have to punt that to the city of Lynn, but
no problem at all.
Yeah,
I'll ask my counselors.
Yeah, good plan. Carl, I think you were first and then Wig.
Thanks. Sorry if I missed it, but did you talk about any transit signal priority? Was that done here? And if so, how was it planned and how is it measured?
Yeah, good question. I was surprised it hadn't come up. This currently isn't activated for transit signal priority in the sense that, in the true transit signal priority sense, in that it reads the vehicle locations and extends the cycle accordingly to let the bus through. These are just in the regular signal cycle. We have a separate initiative right now with BTD signals that is helping to improve some of the functionality of Boston's Traffic Management Center for different types of transit signal priority, which is probably a whole other presentation in and of itself. But we decided not to include TSP on this quarter because there were already so many changes in terms of roadway configuration and agency collaboration and culture and approvals and everything, that we didn't want to kind of confuse the pot. That's not a term, but you know what I mean. But I think as we improve on the current functionality of the Transportation Management Center at BTD through this program that we're working on collaboratively, I think this would be a great corridor to add it in the future.
Thanks.
Yeah. Wig?
Yeah, just another tiny photography question. Did your photographer do the aerials too?
Yeah, so she was able to get, this is from the senior housing building there in Eggleston Square. Yeah, so we didn't use a drone or anything, though I think our consultant HSH does have some drone photos. But she's just on the roof. She worked with the BHA to get roof access to the building, and that's how she's able to get these photos.
Yeah, they're just very clear. I really appreciate the clarity in them. Thanks.
Yeah, I'll forward that along to her because she really is I tell her all the time, I like run out of, I can't say enough nice things about her. I feel like every time she sends me a set of photos, I'm like, thanks, these are really great. And they always really are. So.
I have one more thing to say. I'm really glad you're talking about extending it, because right now, having actually gone down there and seen it, it flies by in a blink as you're going down it. It's kind of like, oh, this is cool, and then like, oh, it's gone.
Yeah.
So I'd be excited to see it extended. And just curious about it in terms of metrics and reporting success. What's the next steps here to be able to say? I mean, do we have a baseline pre the implementation versus post the implementation? I know things are a little goofy with COVID. How do you plan on measuring success, and is there a way to do that in a data-driven way?
Yeah, so we always are measuring the travel time and the reliability. So when I say reliability, I mean the difference between the 90th percentile travel time and the median travel time, because that's where people really experience their biggest gains. It's not really enough to have your average trip improve by 3 minutes. You need your worst trip to improve by 20 minutes because that means you can leave your house 20 minutes later, right? So we are always measuring that for all of our projects. This one, having opened October 30th, basically right before Thanksgiving and Christmas, and then with the snow, I'm not sure when we'll have that data available because we like to make sure that it's representative of the typical day. But I have already put in that request for their ops tech department, so I'm happy to share it back out once I have it. But yeah, we usually try not to do ridership as a metric of success for the transit priority projects because it's so easily influenced by other stuff. But the minimum, sort of like the standard package, is always median travel time, average travel time, and 90th percentile travel time by like 30-minute or 60-minute buckets throughout the day. So we're really trying to not use an overused phrase in a different context, but we're trying to flatten the curve in the variability. We want the trip, if a trip takes 5 minutes when there's no traffic, when we put in a bus lane, we also want it to take 5 minutes at the very worst traffic time of day, right? So we're really just trying to narrow that difference between the longest trips and the typical trips. So we have been measuring this on this corridor. It's just the right reference frame, the right reference time, and when have we collected enough data in order to be able to make a claim.
And beyond the buses themselves, do you actually look at the impact on the cars? So to say like are cars in more traffic, or because of the chicaning and all that other stuff, or is that not? Is the reporting? I'm just curious if you look at the offset essentially to say like, oh, okay, we pick up 5 minutes on the bus, but the cars are, it takes cars on average 45 seconds to make the trip.
Yeah, so we don't look at that directly. So I'm more focused on the data the MBTA controls directly. We have worked with CTPS and other groups who work at the city. MassDOT has access to streetlight data to measure that. But as a standard business practice, we really are more focused on the bus related data. And then for some projects, we will go out and look for, whether through our consultants or through other processes, we'll look for car related data. But this would be a good corridor for us to consider both the car related stuff and the bus related stuff. So,
and I'm thinking of it, it's almost less about, I mean, it's already built, right? You're not going to take it away. It's more about when you walk into the next meeting and somebody says, oh, well, the traffic's already lousy on this bus route. Why, on this street, why would you want to put this down the center of Cummins Highway? And you can say, well, we actually looked at the data and the impact to, yes, there was an impact, but it's an extra 45 seconds for cars. We think that's offset's worth.
Yep, absolutely agree. And actually, we're talking about that with Western Ave because the intersection operations estimates were like really wild. And anecdotally, just going along Western Ave and Lynn, where we put in the bus lane, it doesn't feel like they went from a D level of service to an F level of service, right? So. But this would be another one that we could add on to that analysis.
Len, you've been very quiet. Do you want to chime in? Or actually, Rose as well. Because we're about maybe 7 minutes beyond, but I mean, that doesn't really matter.
I'm fine. I mean, I have some things that I'm going to follow up with Eric about. He mentioned some people that would be good for us to talk with about things. I mean, so the person from about the on-call,
GEC,
yeah,
general engineering contract.
right, yeah, and then you mentioned Livable Streets people about how the public responds to these things. I mean, both before and after, because I know that there are also some thinking about doing this in other places, as you mentioned. I mean, and so Brian came from the advisory board, has reached out to some towns saying, it's just, I guess it isn't so much the Center Lane stuff, but it's about free fares. But I also know in Arlington they've been in discussions with folks about Center Lane, in Arlington for the 77. So these kind of things, it'll be good to have a sense of how the public and businesses think about these things before, and then how they think about them after. So I'll be in touch with you about that. So thank you, though. This is great. Really appreciate you, Eric.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, happy to be here.
Absolutely spectacular. Thank you very much for joining us and for going a little over. Thank you.
Yep. I'm gonna hop off unless you have anything else, and feel free to, like I said, feel free to reach out if you have any questions or if anything else comes up.
Thank you again.
Thanks. Have a good night. See ya.
Let's move into the subcommittee reports. I just noticed we lost Karen. I hope that was not a technical glitch. Len, would you like to do the subcommittee for CIF? Oh, don't forget to unmute.
Yeah, sorry. I was looking for the fair tariff information because I don't remember the details from the meeting. But anyways, we talked with Stephen Plovich, who gave us an overview and an explanation of the reduced fares initiative that the T is promoting, and it pretty much applies to the youth pass. And do you remember the other passes that applies to, Stefan? It's youth pass. Is it the senior pass? I think the senior pass too. The deal is that the roost fares are not system wide. It's really for passes that are already reduced. And essentially what they are doing is making them passes more like passes, instead of just reduced fares, and also they are providing passes over different time ranges, in shorter time ranges, and so yeah, I think overall it's a good thing. As Stephen made it clear, that's been made clear to him, is that these programs cannot be they need to be revenue neutral, and to the extent that they aren't, they can't deviate very much from neutral. And so the T, certainly from the meeting session that I attended for the public, they are getting some pressure to make available means tested fares or provide reduced costs for trips to people who are lower income, and someone's gonna have to come with money, because the T isn't going to do it if it seriously impacts the amount of revenue that it brings in, especially given that the deficits are slated to increase once the extra federal money runs out. And so it's not for lack of desire on the part of staff to do so, but as long as the T has to provide balanced budget is just not in a position to do that. So that was essentially our guest. We had a short meeting, and so our guest Jen Rowe wasn't able to make it, and we're going to discuss some of the obstacles that the people who want to do active transportation encounter when dealing with the MBTA's media. The realty company. I think it's Gray Realty, and so one of the things is that the T charges $100, and I think per month for some of the blue bike stations, and also there is, when it comes to getting the permission to set up a station, the approval time varies a fair amount, from very little times, like maybe a month or two for a station, a Sullivan station, to 18 months for the Wellington station, or for a blue bike station at the Wellington station. So there are just things that we need to work out in order with the T and the company that does the real estate, in order for us all to be on the same page when it comes to making it easier for people who use the T to also do active transportation when it comes to getting to the T. But I guess if we're in places that have high pollution with the to WIG, maybe that's not the way to go. And so I have a question for you, WIG. When it comes to walking, here's I guess the crux of the question. In high polluted areas, are people better off in their cars than they are walking or cycling? Clearly, with cycling, it seems like they are better off not cycling. Would that also be the case for walking? And would you also then make the case that they're better off in the car?
Well, these are good questions. The first thing I want to say is that I don't think each of the contributors to the answer has been accurately worked out. Okay, so, but I do recommend, I see a lot of street sections, cross sections in New Urbanist presentations that have the cyclists right next to the traffic and the pedestrians right next to the traffic. And I recommend having, parked cars can interrupt that pollution, and or just a nice solid hedge that's not too high, so there's no security issues. But, if you have a 3-foot hedge, it's going to be above most of the tailpipes. And just that by itself cuts down on things. The other thing is that, as I mentioned a little bit, city streets that have great kind of small storefront character, they aren't that often the busiest streets in the city from a traffic point of view, especially if there aren't that many lanes. So I do think that it's an issue for everybody, but the health effects, with a few exceptions, like asthma or maybe heart attack for somebody who's vulnerable, the health effects from air pollution, including being real close to large transportation sources, are largely chronic health effects. So I would say, don't worry about really short-term exposures. What you really need to worry about with chronic is, what do you do every day? And do you have high exposures that you know about every day from where you live, which is where you spend most of your time, or from where you work, which is the second most of your time, or in some unusual patterns from the commuting. I do think in the Danish Copenhagen study, which is really high quality environmental epidemiology, that the fact that the cyclists lived in the 10% of the city that's most polluted to start with, and that most people, when they're leaving where they live to go to work or to a public event or to shop, they're usually going from where they live to somewhere where there's more exposure than where they live. You know, there are a few exceptions. Mystic Avenue in Somerville is next to Route 38 and I-93. So there's 200,000 vehicles a day there. And the wind direction there is which we didn't know before we started research 15 years ago. The wind direction lines up exactly with the gentle breezes in the winter, which come usually from the northwest. And that means that air pollution just is like a bowling alley. It just builds up in that corridor. But Len, so in most situations, it's not that stark. But I do think it is an issue for pedestrians. And in all these cases, and more so for pedestrians, security can be an issue too. You know, if there are people who are just normal citizens, they may be older or whatever, but if they're having to walk late at night, you know, you're going to want to be in a well-lit area. So those are really all issues. But yeah, certainly. The pedestrian would
go ahead, please. No, you go ahead, please.
No, the pedestrian certainly will get more if you, and New York City is a pretty good example. You know, Superman, when he was dying, his wife was pretty notable. I mean, Reeves, and his wife died of lung cancer. She never smoked in her life. But she lived in Scarsdale next to a highway because her father was a surgeon who had to get into the city hospitals. And then she lived in exposed areas in New York City. And so after cardiovascular disease, lung cancer is by far the greatest outcome for exposures to high levels of mobile pollution, whether you smoke or not. So I just brought it up, which I don't usually do, because it's a much bigger issue than people think. People think, well, it's not as polluted as it used to be. We don't have the smog that, you know, kind of shuts down cities. And that's true. We've made much greater progress with regional pollutants, a lot of which came from power plants and dirty industry, as well as transportation. But we don't regulate ultrafine particles from transportation. In part because they're so hard to study. And the exposures have health effects still in modern advanced economies that are considerably larger than people will understand.
So with the exposures, a couple of questions. Is it a threshold effect? By that, I mean, is it cumulative? I mean, even at a very low level. I mean,
well,
hold on. I have a couple questions I just want to get out.
Oh, sure. Go ahead. Go ahead. Sorry.
And they're related. And so is it that you could have like a chronic, very low level and never have a bad effect, or have a very low probability of having a bad outcome, or is it always cumulative and at some point you're going to reach a threshold, and the risk profile increases? And the other question is it a matter of how deep the particles go into your lungs? Meaning a person walking is not going to breathe in as deeply as someone cycling very heavily.
Yeah, so those are good questions. Our research has largely focused on ultrafine particles, which are small enough that they translocate from the lungs into your circulation, into everywhere quite readily. Because they're difficult to study, we've shown statistically significant relationships with cardiovascular inflammation, which is what we set out to do about 15 years ago. But we're doing small population studies that aren't going to drive national or most state policies. California is a bit of an exception because they have so much put into mobile exposures, and they had the most serious issues in the country because of the mountains and all their trucks and everything years ago. But in most places, there's not enough resources going into this to easily get the word out or drive regulations in the way that regulations have done a extremely good job over the last 50 years in controlling regional pollution. I mean, really extraordinary advances in regional pollution management. But here's the last thing, Len, and you probably understand this better than most people. An area of cell and cell biology and immunology that has evolved over the last 20 years has identified one, what's called an inflammasome, which basically means it generates interleukin-1 cytokines, which are just inflammatory agents. Now, you need inflammation to manage disease. I mean, that's the cause of, that's the purpose of it. You get a cold or you get something else, your immune system ramps up, but chronic persistent inflammation is always bad. Unfortunately, of 21 human inflammasomes, one inflammasome unifies all immune reaction, and it is triggered by ultrafine particles. So what that means is any pathogenic disease you have, whether it's COVID or, whatever, or any chronic disease you have, which could be heart disease, or it could be Alzheimer's disease, because the NLRP3 inflammasome unifies reaction. It's basically like an army that reinforces other inflammasomes, which are very specific to different viruses or different metabolic processes. But this one cuts across and reinforces all of them. So if you have more exposure to ultrafine particles from aviation or really busy roadways, and you also have diabetes, a lifestyle disease or perhaps a genetic disease, then the diabetes is going to progress faster. And the same thing with COVID and the same thing with other chronic diseases. And because the environmental epidemiology community is largely people who do really great analyses and population analyses and things like that, but they do not have the resources that the molecular biologists or geneticists or immunologists have. And they're largely unaware of this, which is rather staggering, because air pollution regulations in the US over the last 50 years are responsible for more net benefit than all other federal regulations combined, just because of the decrease in premature mortality. So there's a disconnect between the ultrafine particles, the environmental justice population, and everything. And honest to God, I mean, it's been driving me crazy for 4.5 years, because I tend to wander off on my own and kind of be a scout in these kinds of areas, and then try to get other people to focus on them, whether it's the Green Line or whether it's environmental health or, changing Assembly Square. And this one is proving to be a tough nut, not because of people, but because it's hard to get the knowledge transfer to work well enough for people to do something about it.
Great, thanks. Well, that's my report.
Thank you both. We're a little behind schedule, but I think that's okay. I will go through the marketing and communications operations subcommittee notes pretty quickly. I'll just basically give highlighted bullet points. We had our special guest, Dave Carney, who's now the Chief of Transit Services. He's now in charge of all modes of MBTA transit. He was one of our guests at the subcommittee, and also Bill Wolfgang, who's the Director of Vehicle Engineering. Much of the subcommittee meeting will focus on the latest of the latest news of the acceptance and delivery and acceptance of the CRRC new orange and red line cars. Bill told us that there's now 58 that are accepted, meaning that they've been, the sign off has happened and the MBTA officially owns them. There's 58 of them as of February 8th. The process is kicking off already for the scrapping of the current old Orange Line cars made by Hawker Siddeley. And Bill said that there's still 4 tracks that are not back in service at the Wellington Car House after the renovation restoration at Wellington. And so having 4 tracks out of service still is partly why they want to get the scrapping process for the old ones underway, because they need the space. The bearer pads on the CRRC cars are now completely replaced. All the new deliveries will have the newer design of the bearer pads, which was a component that took those new cars out of service for a while. So no more issues with the bearer pads. The next discussion that we had was about how the service planning schedule changes for each rating get into the system, the vehicle display systems. And I had a follow-up with Bill, and he said that it's essentially what we thought. There's a download process, and it sounds like there's some improvement to be made over how tight that process is or is not. So more to come on that. There's we also had a discussion of what goes into bus replacements for rail maintenance shutdowns. Talked about the agreement with the 589 Carmen's Union that removed the previous 30% staffing requirement for bus substitution. Up until recently, there had been a labor agreement with 589 that said that 30% of all jobs for bus replacement would be from the Carmen's Union, and now that has been renegotiated, so that gives more flexibility when doing rail maintenance projects. That it can be up to 100% a third-party carrier doing the bus operations. We also talked about de-icing and where it's used, when it's used. For example, I didn't know that the sleet and ice scrapers that are sometimes rarely used on the green line and blue line overhead catenary wire. It's done very judiciously, because the scraping action to try to get the ice off can have a detrimental effect on that overhead wire. There also is de-icing that is installed on the heavy rail, red, blue, and orange, but they are entirely on the older fleet. So I have a to-do item about asking about what the de-icing is like on the new CRRC cars. And finally, we had a discussion about autonomous bus operations. Some discussion about the design history of the Silver Line tunnel, pros and cons of speed versus line of sight operation, no signals versus the tunnel width. And then finally, we talked about the Haymarket area construction project that's primarily taking down the old garage, and how that's been, according to Dave Carney, highly successful. He called it a really very successful coordination between the produce vendors at the Haymarket, the market part of Haymarket, really good coordination with the RMV office at there, transit police. He's extremely pleased about that. That's it in a nutshell. We're just after quarter of. So any reports on new business, old business, external meetings? I actually, if there's nothing else that anybody wants to bring up, I don't want to put you on the spot, Rose, but since it's our first time having you, would you like to, and again, this is completely optional, I don't want to catch you off guard, but if you feel like it, could you tell us a little bit about your background. What are your areas of focus, areas of interest? The kinds of things you're working on and hope to be working on.
Sure. Yeah, I can talk about that. So I grew up in the Boston area. I then transplanted to Chicago, and actually worked in neuroscience research for a while, moved to Los Angeles, got really more engaged in transportation. So I went back to graduate school, got a master's degree in urban planning, really interested in basically all forms of transportation, just taking a human-centered approach, making sure people can get to where they need to go safely, and that it's accessible to everybody. So worked for the city of Los Angeles, did a lot of data analysis for their Vision Zero program, and then worked on some placemaking programs like our People Street program, which takes underutilized pieces of roadway like slip lanes and closes it to make vibrant pedestrian spaces. Also did our on-street dining program in Los Angeles. And so I'm currently actually still on the West Coast, moving back to the Boston area next month. And so right now I'm working on a lot of data-driven projects for the MBTA on their fare equity and service equity, and thinking about futures of integrating mobility, other mobility modes into the T, and how they can set a policy to make that run smoothly.
So what kind of neuroscience research did you do?
I did a lot of brain imaging studies, and so it was like neuropsychiatry. So first I did a lot of, it's called intermittent explosive disorder, IED. So looking at people with anger problems, how they reacted to people with different facial expressions, how their brain interpreted that, and how that was different from people who didn't have explosive anger problems. And then I also did that similar type of research on children with autism, looking at how their brain processed information differently than children without autism.
Oh, that's really cool. That's really interesting stuff. I did research on Alzheimer's and Huntington's, with using transgenic fruit flies. So that was my exposure to neuroscience. It's really interesting stuff. But that's on kind of like the pathological side of neuroscience. You're on the very much alive side of it, and really trying to figure out how the brain works when it's not dying. And so no, that's really, really cool stuff. Yeah. And the imaging stuff is really intense. Wow, cool. But it's all transportation, brains, it's all just one big network, right?
Yeah,
one
exactly.
complex network that is processing lots and lots of information. Yeah. Cool. Well, welcome aboard. Welcome back to Boston.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah,
I've been gone for a long
move goes
time.
smoothly.
So yeah, thanks a lot.
I hope it's one of these moves where somebody boxes everything up and they move it for you, and you just have to fly across the country.
We'll see. I got a husband, a small child, and 2 cats who are coming with me. So we're trying to figure out how to do that.
That's intense. That's going to be very intense. Has a small child ever seen snow?
Yeah.
Okay.
Maybe over Christmas. We actually
Gotcha.
had sleet here last week, and the sleet was enough to make it look like there was snow.
In LA, you had sleet.
Yeah, it was hail. Sorry, it was hail.
Okay, yeah, it's a huge difference.
Yeah, I know.
It's like I didn't hear about LA getting that cold.
No, we got hail.
Yeah, because of course anything under 60 is like
yeah.
It's like,
and actually you can see snow in the mountains in the distance, so you can see snow every day. It's just not in our yard. Yeah.
I'm curious about over the time that you've been working for CTPS so far, have you come across something where you said, okay, I'm working on this now, but I really want to work on this thing next, or like I hope I can get to work on this thing? If nothing comes to mind, it's okay.
Yeah, I wouldn't say yet. I'm just trying to, get a lay of the land, as there are things that are very different and there are things that are the same everywhere. And so just trying to figure out where I am and where the city's at. Yeah.
modeling with Marty Milkovich could be one of those. I think I pronounced his name incorrectly. Marty Milka.
I know who you're
Yeah,
speaking
yeah,
of, but
yeah.
I don't know that I know
Yeah,
his name
he
well
does
enough to pronounce it better.
he does the modeling for the travel demand models. Yeah, so he's a really
Yeah.
good guy.
And I did some of that with the city of LA too. So
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to working with them more as well.
Yeah, and so
Yeah.
so I guess you're working closely with Stephen Andrews.
Yes.
Yeah, Stephen's a great guy. He used to attend, these meetings, in particular the capital investment and finance subcommittee meetings, when we were only finance at the time. So Stephen's been around a long time. He's a really good guy. Yeah. In fact, everyone at CPS is great.
Oh yeah. How about Jonathan Belcher? Have you done anything with him?
Yeah. He's in my group
Excellent.
currently, and so I haven't worked with him closely, but he's in a meeting I'm in weekly, and he's an encyclopedia of knowledge.
Right.
Yeah, that's an understatement.
And he will tell you why every idea you have isn't going to work. But he can back it up,
those motorcycle lanes in the LA highways used to freak me out. I thought, boy, how did those guys not get in accidents? Holy crow.
It's a scary place to drive. I was car free in Chicago, and then LA was a rude awakening.
And they probably have a lot of exposures too. But you made me think of one thing that I forgot to tell Len, which is that when we look at ultrafine particles, and there's some pretty good scientists at USC and UCLA, by the way, as well as everywhere in California, actually, Irvine, UC Davis. But when we're studying things like highways in Boston, and we're looking at primary ultrafines from transportation, meaning the ones that are formed really quickly, cold weather causes the semi-volatile organics to want to be particles. So you get an explosion in ultrafine particles in, cold, clear winter mornings that look beautiful, that aren't windy, or may have gentle wind. You get an explosion of ultrafine particle creation because of the semi-volatiles as they cool. And it's very different from regional pollution. And it's one of those things that few people who kind of don't dive into this stuff might suspect. So just thought I would mention that.
So don't go for a run on very cold mornings, what you say.
Yeah, so cold cities have much greater disparities in the health effects from transportation pollution between the people who live next to the busy corridors and the people who live a kilometer away. Warm cities would not have as extreme a difference because they don't have that explosion of semi-volatiles turning into ultrafines in the wintertime. And unfortunately, when you reduce the regional fine particles, which would be where the semi-volatiles would condense onto, when you take them out of the air, there's a lot more creation of new ultrafine particles because their only choice is to become their own particle as opposed to become an addition to a pre-existing particle. So there are kind of there are some unexpected phenomena, and so a lot of the great research in this stuff comes from Scandinavia or Canada or cooler cities in the U.S. But we tend not to do as we tend not to focus as much on public and environmental health as some of the more socialized countries.
Oh, I just remembered something real quick. We're coming up on the top of the hour. One thing I did want to mention very quickly, I'm not going to go into detail on it. It's sort of an external meeting under that part of the agenda. I didn't go on the trip, but I did join the trip attendees at the end of it for a farewell to trackless trolleys in North Cambridge, which happened this past Saturday. I went not really to be like, oh, we're gonna miss trackless trolleys. I mean, there was a lot of that. But I went to actually see to remind myself of the footprint of that property, and I took a lot of pictures of how it's laid out, etc. I mean, there was a really good presentation done just by the MBTA just recently, talking about the conversion from overhead electric trackless trolleys over the next, I think it's going to be about a 2-year project to completely replace them all with battery electric buses. And that North Cambridge car house is being completely demolished and completely reconstructed with overhead charging stations. Unfortunately, in the intervening couple of years, it's going to be diesel hybrids, but primarily diesel powered, that are going to be running in that North Cambridge area. So there's going to be higher localized emissions from MBTA operations in North Cambridge until a couple of years from now the battery electrics get in. But if anybody's interested, I can put together some of the best photos. Again, it's not about the fan trip part of it, but I did take a lot of pictures of that North Cambridge facility, which is going to be completely leveled. So I'll stop there. And
well, so you know, I used to live in that high-rise building that's right next to that bus yard, that brown building. You know, it's a cubicle building. We called it the Borg building. You know, it's just it's so nondescript. It just looks like a big brown cube. Yeah.
I will make one kind of a cool observation, which I've been to that North Cambridge car house before, but I didn't really appreciate how the switching is controlled, because I mean, they're not rail vehicles, so they don't have switches on the ground, but in the catenary wires, there are switches. So if you're trying to operate the trackless trolley and you want to go into the 4th of 6 garage bays, I forget how I mean, you can't just drive on your own control. You've got to throw a bunch of switches to make the overhead catenary wires line up in that way. And the mechanism, I had no idea it was so complicated and cool. For some of the routing in the yard, you actually press a series of buttons, and then unfortunately on a cold day like Saturday, they were all frozen up and they weren't working, so they were throwing them manually. But the inspector that was there said, yeah, when it's working, you press the series of buttons for where you want your vehicle to go, and then overhead you hear click 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 as they all change their alignment. So it's all going away, but I thought that was very cool to see the way that things. Well, if you want to ride on a trackless trolley on the MBTA system, you've got until Friday, end of service, March 11th. The new rating starts March 12th, and that's when they're going to be doing the diesel replacements. No more trackless trolleys as of end of service March 11th. I'll stop there and ask Barry or anybody else public comment for the end of our evening. I don't see anybody contributing anything by chat on YouTube, so that may mean we're ready to wrap up unless anybody else wants to say anything.
No, then I'll make a motion to close.
All right.
Second.
Thank you all again. Welcome aboard, Rose.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Hopefully we didn't scare you off, and hopefully we'll see you at a future meeting.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Thanks, gang. I will shut down the Zoom and stop the recording.